Check, check, 1, 2. Mic check, 1, 2. And just check if my redirect works. Oh. Cool. All right, so the plan is to take a basic MERN stack application, and I'm going to go through these 3 different portions. First, I'm going to Dockerize that application, including the API server, which is built with Express. Then I'm going to Dockerize the React client, set up Docker Compose to handle the coordination between those containers when I run them, run a MongoDB image so that I don't have to run the database locally on my system and can run that in a container as well. And then I'll set up hot reloading so that we'll have a nice development environment where we can modify the code and see those reflected inside the container when we actually go about and run that. So the very first thing I'm going to do is just run the application as is. I ran a version of this in a video a while back on my channel. So that was the Docker Compose tutorial where I went through in 6 minutes and just very rapidly showcased how to set up Docker Compose. This is going to be sort of a walkthrough end-to-end of getting started with this application, Dockerizing it, and then deploying it onto a DigitalOcean VM. So that'll be the full process, and I'll just jump right into it. The very first thing that I'm going to do is to start the database. And I installed this database using Homebrew. So in order to do that, I'll just do brew services start and then the version that I'm running. So we've got it successfully running there. We can do brew services list. And that will give us the different services that are running. Here we see Homebrew running, MongoDB running, and that's going to be running on port 27017, which is the default port. For the backend, I'm located within this server directory, and I'm going to call this yarn start script, which will just run node and then index.js. So it'll be yarn start. And so now we've got our API running on port 5000. We can actually check that it's running by just hitting localhost on 5000. And we see this hello world response. Cool. Then we're going to need to run the client. So the client, similarly, will use that yarn start method. So that'll call this script here, which will be React script start. And so this was all set up when you run that create React app. At the very beginning, you get all these different scripts that you can run. React script start will start a development version of the server and then open up a browser for me to view it. When we actually deploy this, we're going to use yarn build, which will instead set up a static set of JavaScript, CSS, and HTML files that we can then deploy. But for development purposes, we'll use yarn start. And so that's running on port 3000. And we see this super simple, basic MERN stack application. If we go to list movies, there's no movies in the database, so nothing shows up. But we can go to create movie, and we'll just create a test movie here. We're going to rate it 10 out of 10, and the time is going to be noon. Click add movie, then it's added successfully. And so if I go back to list movie, it shows up here. I can then update this. And it will be reflected. So we've got full CRUD functionality here. Oh, hey, immigrant programmers, welcome to the stream. Yeah, I was recording this video and then I just decided to do it live. So welcome to the stream. And it's going to be a long one. I've got a lot of things to do here, if you see from my to-do list. But we are just on number 1. So happy to answer questions throughout as well, as long as I don't get too distracted. So that's the basic application. I'm going to go ahead and stop it so that we can start jumping into some of these other steps. So I'll kill the server, kill the client, and run brew services stop MongoDB. Okay, so that is good. We've got everything stopped, and so the very first thing that I'm going to do is to Dockerize the Express-based server. And so that is in this directory. I'm going to go ahead and exit one of these. Cool. And so in order to Dockerize the server, I'm going to create a Dockerfile within here. Okay, that should be good. And I'm going to use the Node version 14 base image. So whenever you're looking for a base image, I usually try to find the official one. So I'll just do Node.js Dockerfile, and hopefully we'll get a Docker Hub. Here we go. Here's the official page for the Node.js Docker image. And we have all these different tags. Some of them are based on Alpine Linux, which is a slimmed down version of Linux. Some are based on Debian, and so it'll have the different version of Debian in the tag. We're going to just use the Node 14 Slim image. So 14-slim, and that is this particular image. And that should be just fine for our purposes. I'm using the Slim image because it has fewer dependencies installed. My application is pretty simple, so I'd much rather have that smaller image size than have a bunch of dependencies installed out of the box. So I'm going to do node. So we'll do from, and then the name of that image, node 14-slim. And so that should be a good starting point. Now, the very first thing that I'm going to do is just set a working directory within this container image. And so this is just the convention for where the source code is going to live. And so the command for that is workdir, and then I'm just going to use user source app. And so that, now that I've run that command, will set the working directory where I'm going to put my source code and where I'm going to run commands from. Then I need to copy in my package.json and yarn.lock files. So I'll use the copy command for that. And so it'll be package.json, and I'll copy it to /. And so because I set this working directory, that now corresponds to this location within that container. I would then also copy in the yarn.lock file. To the same location. And so the reason that I'm copying these files first and not just copying in all the source code is that Docker has a pretty smart caching system where each of these commands builds upon the previous layer. And so any modification to something that would impact one line within this Docker file will then impact, and I'll have to rerun the rest. And so by doing this first and then running yarn install, now I'll be able to modify dependencies, which I'm going to copy in here in a minute, without having to reinstall all my dependencies every time I build that image. So now after line 8, I will have installed all my dependencies. I'll then copy in the rest of my source code with the copy current directory to current directory. There is one additional modification that I want to make though, and that is to add a Docker ignore file. And the reason that I'm going to do this is because I don't actually want to copy in my local node modules directory, because that has all of the macOS specific modules installed. Instead, what I would much rather do is copy in everything except for those, and then I'll install them as I just did on the previous line. Also, if you're in the stream, let me know how my audio is. I think it's coming in a little loud, so I'm going to turn it down just a touch. Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me and if it's good audio levels. Okay, so within this Docker ignore file, I'm just going to put node modules, and that just tells Docker when it's building the image to not copy in the contents of this directory. That should be good. I'm going to run my API server on port 5000, expose 5000. And then finally, I'm going to set the command that gets run when I run this container. And so that is going to be that yarn start command that I used before to actually start the server. And that should be all that I need to do for that particular Dockerfile. I'm going to then create a makefile here. And so I use makefiles just to store off various commands that I'll need later. So here, I'm going to store off a build command. So build will be Docker build. I'm going to tag it as like API server or something. Yeah, I'll just call it API server. And then I'll use the period here to indicate current directory. So if I do make build, it will run that command, and that will go off and tag it with the API server tag. Awesome. So that should be good. Now I'm going to move on to the client. So it's actually going to be quite similar. So I'm actually going to copy this, and the client Dockerfile is going to be identical with the one modification that it's going to be running on port 3000. I'm trying to think if there's any other modifications to make. I think it should be fine. Yeah, let's just leave that for now. Again, yarn start is the command that we want. I do need the Docker ignore file. And again, it's going to contain node modules. And so I also want the same build target, except this time I will call this React app. And so now I have a client image and a server image built. The final piece that I need to get into Docker is going to be the database itself. And so because I don't need to make any modifications to the database, I'm just going to use the public mongo Docker Hub image. So this is the official version of MongoDB from Docker Hub. I'm going to use the 4.4 version, I think should be fine. So I'll do 4.4 Bionic as my version. And I'm going to use Docker Hub to coordinate all of these images working together. So I could, given my current state, I could say Docker run and then pass all the different options required. Docker run over here for the server as well. I could then run the MongoDB image, but coordinating all the different networking and volumes and everything between all these images would require a ton of different commands. And so instead, I'm going to use Docker Compose. And so I'll put a file at the top level, and this will be compose.yaml. And I'll move that up. Or I'll call it Docker Compose.yaml. Okay. And so here, this is kind of the contents of that other video. If you've already seen that, sorry for the duplication. But we're just going to specify the version of the Docker Compose API that we're going to use. So that's version 3. That's the latest major version. We then need to specify the 3 different services that are included in our application. So we have services. The first one will have React app. The second one will be API server. Third one will be Mongo. We then will have networks and volumes as well. So let's go through and define what these actually are. The React app, I will use the image tag, and that will be React app, like we just tagged it before. We can also specify a build directory, and so that will be client. And so Docker Compose, if you give it a build directory, you don't have to pre-build it ahead of time. So I can just specify that, and then it will know that the client lives within the client directory, and it could go build it on the fly. We will do standard in open equals true. And this was something I discovered when I was first setting this project up, is that by default, when you run the create React app development server on the particular version of Linux that my Docker image is using, it would immediately exit. And so by using the standard in open true, it's kind of a workaround to get around that particular issue. We want to set up the ports for this. So this is going to be, as I said, it's on port 3000. And we want that to be mapped to 3000 on my host system, so onto my MacBook. 3000, 3000. Great. That should be fine. And then networks. I'm going to create a network here in a second called MERN app, and I'll create that down here. And so by adding all three of these to the same network, they'll be able to communicate with one another. So MERN app, and then I'll just use the default driver for that. Driver is the bridge driver. That should be good. And I will say, yeah, that should be fine for that section for now. The API server is going to be similar. I'll specify the image. API server is what I called it. Again, we can specify the build directory. This time it's /server. We want to use the ports directive, and this one's going to be running on port 5000. Great, and I'll attach it to that same network. MERN app. And then because the MongoDB database has to be running before you start the API server, because it's going to try to connect upon startup, I will specify that this depends on Mongo, which we're going to define here in a second. Okay. And then the Mongo service, we will specify the image as Mongo, and then that tag that we wanted was 4.4-Bionic. Port is going to be 27017, which is the default port for MongoDB. 27017. 27017. Great. Attach it to the same network. App. And if I have any typos, you should call them out in the chat. You can be my remote debugging system. The final thing that I want to do for Mongo is set up a data volume. And so this is going to be where the database actually stores its data, since by default it would be contained within the local file system of that container, which is isolated from my host file system. And so if I remove that, it would then disappear. So I will create a data volume called Mongo data. And I'll call that, use the default driver, which is just the local driver. And then we need to mount that in. And so we specify the name of the volume here to start. So that'll be Mongo data. And then within the container, the path that will be mounted into is going to be the default path where MongoDB normally stores its data, which is data/db. And so, assuming I didn't mess anything up here, which who knows if I did, we should be okay to build and run our application. There is one modification that I know that I need to make to my API server, and that is the connection string to the database itself. When I was running it locally on my MacBook, you would connect to localhost, but now that both of these things are inside of containers, I need to change this host name to match the service name where the database is running. So within this Docker Compose, I named my Mongo service Mongo, and so that's where I get this value that I will put in here. And so I'm going to go ahead and build my API server and my React app again, just for good measure. And now I'll go up And I should just be able to do docker compose up, but I'm going to create a makefile because I'll be using it later. This will be run dev. This will be docker compose up. And let's see, fingers crossed, we'll see if we get any errors. It looks like we might have succeeded first try. Let's see. So if I go back to port 3000 and I refresh the page, we get no movies because it's a new database with no data in it. But if we create a movie, Dockerized test movie, this one's only rated 5 out of 10, and we're going to say it's at 1 o'clock. Hopefully, we insert it successfully. Awesome. Cool. So that is sort of the process of we created these Docker images for our client and our server. We got a publicly available MongoDB image to use for the database. And then we set up our Docker compose file that contains all of the necessary information to tell Docker how to spin up those containers, as well as how they need to talk to one another on this network and where to store the data. There's one more additional step that I want to do in this first part before I move on to part 2, and that is to mount our source code in. So I'm actually going to kill this here. Currently, if I made a modification to the application code, it would not show up in my website in the browser until I rebuilt the image. We can get around this, and which is very useful from a development perspective, by actually mounting in the directory of our code into the container itself. And so I'm going to add a data volume to each of these. So this will be volumes. And then I will specify that for the React app, I want to mount in the client directory. Excuse me. I'm going to mount in the client directory here. And I'm going to mount that to the path within the application that I stored the source. So that'll be user source app. I do need to make one additional modification, and because this client directory also contains this node modules directory, which we ignored when we went and built our image, we need to take consideration of that when we mount this volume in. The way that we can get around it is to just add an additional mount at that path with no local path specified. So instead of having anything on the left side of the colon, I'm just going to directly say user source app node modules. And so this basically says, don't take anything from my local system at this path. And so that will enable the Dockerfile, or sorry, the container, to use the version of the node modules that were installed when we ran our Docker build command. We want to do the same thing on the server side, which we can do here. And I think that should be good to go. So I'm going to, once again, make run dev. Not sure why that's taken a long time, but it looks like it is working. So if I refresh the page here, list movies, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so it looks like I broke something because now I'm not getting the movies and I'm not able to create a movie. So let's try to figure out what I broke, and we'll get to see some live debugging. React scripts not found. So on my API server, I mounted in the client directory rather than the server directory, because I copied and pasted and did not modify. So let me stop it. run it. Now let's see what we got. Okay, now we have our test movie from before, so we seem to have fixed it. But we should be able to test whether or not the application source code that we mounted in, whether we can modify that on the fly now. So let's change something about our header. So in our client, we have simple MERN app. And let's change it by adding an exclamation point, because we're all excited. I hit it, I save it, and then it hot reloads, and we get that reflected at the end of part 1. So let's go add some check marks just to feel good about ourselves. And if you're in the chat and have any questions about what I did in part 1, I'd be happy to pause for a second and answer things before I dive into part 2. If there's no questions, I guess that means everything is understood and we can proceed. So we've got it as sort of this development specific Docker compose setup. There's a number of things that we are going to want to change before we deploy this. First off, our database has no password on it, so that is very bad. We have our source code mounted into the container. We never want to mount in a executable code that is going to get run. Instead, we want to build all of that as a static container image. And whenever we make a change, we would then go off and build it within a continuous integration system and deploy that static image. We also are hard coding some things within our source. For example, when we had to modify the path that the database was connecting on, we went and modified it here. This would be much better to pull out as an environment variable, and so we'll do that. Yeah, so there's a number of things that we're going to do. The first thing that I'm going to do is to create a separate sort of development and production Docker file. So I'll start by copying this, renaming one of them to be -dev, and one of them to be -prod, -production. That should be fine. One thing that we want to make sure to do in our production version is to add a, we no longer need these build directories, so we're going to get rid of that, because we will always have the image available for us. We're going to add the restart unless stopped command. Let me make this full screen. And so what this is going to do is, if the application exit for whatever reason, Docker is going to try to restart it unless we physically told Docker to stop. So this provides us a little bit of robustness against some quirky bug that comes and causes our app to crash. Docker will, in the background, try to restart it for us, which is a good thing. I want that on both of these. I'm actually going to remove the Mongo image entirely, I think, because I'm going to move Mongo, my database, to MongoDB Atlas, which is a database as a service provided by Mongo. And so I'm just going to strip this out entirely. Okay. Like I said, I'm going to remove these source code mounts because we don't want to mount in our source code into the image. And that should be about all we need to do, at least for getting started. I'm going to change my image name here to production and production, so that I don't accidentally cause my run my development image in production. So I'll tag it as such. Rather than running on 3000, I'm going to run on port 80 and port 443. So these are the conventional ports. 80 would be HTTP, and 443 would be HTTPS. Okay, so I've separated that out. I'm going to add some new make targets in my make file. So this will be build production, docker build -t app production. And then I'm actually going to pass a -f command to pass it a specific file. So it'll be Dockerfile production. And I want to copy that. We're going to make some more modifications to that in a bit. We're actually going to use a multi-stage Dockerfile where we build our Node app and then build our React app, and then copy those files into a Caddy web server, which is a web server that will set up HTTPS automatically for us. So I will hold off on that for now, but yeah, should be fine. Run yarn build. So this will be the build command, and then we're going to add here in a minute, copy into secondary Caddy stage. So that's still a to-do. Similarly, on the server side, I'm trying to think if there's any modifications required. I think my server side should be fine. I do need to extract out the environment variables into a config file. Yeah, so for the server side, I'll have a config folder. This will have a dev.env, local.env, and production.env. And so these are going to contain things such as that Mongo database URI. So here, this was here. URI. And so that is what it is when I run it in my development environment. For my local environment, I'm actually going to move, as I said, move that database to Atlas. So I'm going to go and do that now. I actually went ahead and did it ahead of time, but I can show you what I did. I just have a free cluster running on Atlas. They allow you to have a very small cluster set up for free. And this cluster I'm actually sharing between two applications, one of which is the application that I built or the one that I sort of added DevOps practices to for the Traversy Media channel. So it is running here on this database, and then I added a new database to the same cluster. If I click here, we can see under collections, side by side, I have the Storybooks database from that other app, and then this Cinema database for this particular app. And so off screen, I'm going to copy the password for this into my environment variables file so that I can connect to it. So I'm going to pull this off screen. Okay. Cool. And so now I have my my environment file set up with the necessary information to connect into the database. I do then need to modify my connection string, which will be, let's see, let me close these. My connection string, which lives here in this database index file, and I'm going to read that in now from an environment variable. So that'll be process .env.mongo URI. And the reason that this works is because I'm already using the .env package here on my server, which will load in that appropriate environment file that I pass to it at runtime and populate that environment variable, the mongo URI environment variable from there. And then I can read it out with that process.env syntax. Jatin Mishra says, do I have a Udemy course? I do not have any courses right now. All my content right now is just freely available on YouTube. I may do some courses in the future, but for now, it's just YouTube based. Okay, so back here, we've pulled out our Mongo URI into our different environment variables. We have the database moved over to Atlas, as I was showing you. It's pretty straightforward to set up within the GUI. You can also set up with an infrastructure as code tool like Terraform if you want. But for learning purposes, I think it's fine just to go and click in the GUI and create it. Although the best practice in terms of a DevOps flow would be to create it using something like Terraform. What do I have next on my to-do list here? So we have separate Docker Compose files, move DB to Atlas, update client to build production version. So I'll do that next. I also, within here, this is going to be the same. I'll do a make build local or build dev. And so this will, the first thing, let's go into the client directory and then build it. Make. And so by using this syntax, I can recursively call make. And so I'm going to move from my top level directory into the client directory. And then from there, I'll run my make build target. Yeah, I definitely plan to do a deep dive on Terraform, Eugene. That's definitely a topic that I would like to tackle sometime early next year if I have the time. In addition to building the client, we want to cd into server and make build. And so that will produce two things here. Did I change this? No, let's just make build. Let's make this make build dev. So now in this make file, I want to do this will be make build is fine. My top level one. Now this should call make build dev. And now let's add one for make build production. Okay. And so the versions I have here are going to be dev, which are going to be entirely running those development-based Docker files. I'm then going to have a local, and my local version is going to be running my Caddy web server. So it's not going to be running that development version of the React client. It's going to be run the Caddy web server, and it's going to be using the Atlas database. And then separate from that, I'll have my production. And my production one will similarly have the Caddy version. The only difference here is going to be whether or not I am connected into, I guess, yeah, whether or not I hot load my source code into the container itself. So here I want to have everything baked into the image. Here I'm going to set it up to hot reload and mount that source. MS Web Dev Girl, hello. Welcome. And then this needs to be production. And this is the version that I'll actually run on my DigitalOcean virtual machine that I set up here shortly. This will be local. Okay. So the next step is going to be to take my client and build the image, build the React app itself into the static set of HTML, JavaScript, and CSS files, and then copy those into a Caddy web server. So this Dockerfile production is going to start very much the same way that it did before, but then we're going to have a secondary stage. So this is a really useful technique when you're working with Docker. So this will be first stage, and that's where all my dependencies live and how I build my app. And then here is second stage, and here I'm going to start from a different base image. And so this one I'm going to do Caddy. Let's check out the Caddy file. Caddy Docker Hub. And so Caddy is a really interesting web server that has a ton of great features. You can set it up as a reverse proxy. You can set it up as a file server. It's pretty simple to get started with. And the real killer feature is that it sets up HTTPS for you. So as long as you configure everything correctly, it will set up HTTPS automatically. So I'm going to use this tag. Should be fine. Then I want to pass in a Caddy file, and so I'm going to do that dynamically so that I can have different Caddy files for different whether I'm running locally or whether I'm running in production, because I need to set that up slightly differently because of how HTTPS is set up. Locally, I'm not going to set up HTTPS. It'll just be running on localhost on port 80. But when I actually deploy it to the VM, it will be set up with a certificate. So I'm going to set an arg. So this will be a argument that is only available during build time. So if I use the arg command, it's only available at build time. If I use the env command, it'll be available within the container itself. So here, I'm going to have this Caddy file. And then I'm going to copy, and I'll reference this argument. So the way that we reference that is $ curly braces Caddy file. So whatever I pass in at build time there, I'm going to pass in a path to my Caddy file. And the Caddy file is how you configure Caddy itself. And then we want to copy that into this etc Caddy file. And this is the default location where Caddy is looking for this configuration file. And so now I need to actually create those files. So the first one will be Caddy file .local. And this we'll do a few things. We'll do HTTP / localhost on port 80. So that is the domain that I'm going to serve on locally. Within here, I'm going to set the root to my /srv, so /serve, which is where I'm going to have my website files hosted in the container. And then I'm going to set up a root, and this is going to allow me to configure Caddy as a reverse proxy, so that when I hit the just localhost with no additional URL parameters or anything, it will take me to my React app. But if I go to /API, it will route the traffic directly to my Express backend. So to do that, we can do route and then use the reverse proxy directive, proxy /API star. So this is going to capture anything, any path API that starts with /API. And then I'm going to route that to my API server container. So API server is what I named it within the Docker compose file. And it's on port 5000. And then try files path. Oop. And this is going to go to index.html. So basically, this is going to allow, if we hit a different path that is not API, it's going to tell Caddy where to try to look for those files, and it's going to fall back to this index.html in the root serve directory. And so that should give us what we want in terms of serving our React app from that base index.html. And then finally, we need to specify this file server directive. Okay. Now we need to set up our makefile to actually use this. So I'm going to do that now. We're here. And we're going to separate this over a few lines. This will be React App Production. And let's actually tag it with the local version here. That's good. Actually, it's going to use the same Dockerfile. Since we added that, we could have had a separate Dockerfile, but because we did it this way with the argument, we'll be able to use the same Dockerfile for both of these use cases. We then need to specify two things. We need to specify the build argument Caddy file. And so this is going to get substituted in our Dockerfile here. And so we're basically specifying which of our Caddy file, or we're going to create a Caddy file.production here in a minute, but which one we want to use. And so this will be Caddy file.local. And then we want one more build arg, and that is going to be the base URL. And so I haven't modified our source code here yet, but the base URL is going to specify where the API server lives. So for our local version, it's going to be http://localhost 5000/API. That should be fine. Save that. I'm just going to check on the chat here. Thank you so much for this tutorial, facing a challenge to move from dev into prod. Yeah, I think there's a lot of considerations that need to be taken into account when you're taking a system and getting it ready for production. So hopefully this can help give you some good tips along the way. MS Web Dev Girl says, so I'm building a React portfolio website. It's kind of simplistic. Everyone wants to see React websites, even though this project doesn't really need React. Yeah, I think using React just so that you have more familiarity with it and can talk about which parts you like and which parts you don't like is a valuable thing. So I don't see any problem with that. Thoughts on Pulumi versus Terraform? I haven't used Pulumi personally. I really like Terraform. I have heard Pulumi is nice to work with, and I know that it uses more general purpose languages like Python, whereas Terraform you have to learn their specific HashiCorp configuration language, HCL. So I don't have any experience with Pulumi, but I do like Terraform a lot. Cool. So I added this option here, and that is going to live in my API setup. So here in my client source API index, I have hard coded this base URL here, but instead, now that I set it in my Docker build command, I can use process.env.react app base URL is what I'm going to call it. And I need to then set that within my Dockerfile here. Before I build it, I'm going to do arg base URL env react app base URL, and that is going to be whatever I set this to here. And then on my local host, so I need to set it as an environment variable here in my production one, but on my local Dockerfile, I can just hard code that here as localhost 5000. Okay. So now we are building our image, we're copying in that Caddy file dynamically. We then need to finish off our Dockerfile here. And the way that we do that is we're going to copy our files from our first stage. So this will be from builder, and I'm going to name this top stage as builder. So I'm naming this first stage, and then I can copy from it. So this is how I reference that down here below. And I'm going to copy from user source app build. So /user /source /app. So that's that work directory. And then /build is where the files get populated when we run the yarn build command there in line 16. And I want to copy that to the /src directory, SRV, sorry, the serve directory. Finally, I'm going to expose 80 and, let me capitalize that, expose 80, and I'll expose 443. Even though we're not using it locally, that's fine. So this Docker file now should be able to use for local or for production. And Eugene asks if it's advisable to use Docker Compose in production. So the main reason not to use Docker Compose in production is that one of the primary benefits of using Docker and containers in general is the ability to run many different instances of them and very quickly bring them up and tear them down and scale them out. And so using a Docker Compose setup essentially locks you into having a specific one copy, or however you've defined your compose file, of each service. And so from that perspective, you would probably not want to use Docker Compose. I'm using it here as an example, but you would probably want to use something like Docker Swarm or Kubernetes if you get to a larger, more complex system where you need to have lots of different replicas of your applications and services and scale them independently of each other. So hopefully that answers the question. Here I'm using it just to showcase how do we take our app, bundle it up as a container, use some best practices around configuring things, how we're going to have separate development versus production versus local run configurations, and then get it running live on the server. But if we did want to make this a more robust thing, I would likely, even rather than use Docker Compose, I would set up my CI pipeline, my continuous integration, continuous delivery pipeline, to deploy the Docker containers individually. This would also enable you to make a modification to either just the client or just the server and not have them fully coupled like this. You want to try to decouple things. And so probably not using Docker Compose in production, but here I'm just using it so that I can get everything spun up and showcase it running. Good question though. Okay. I then need to add a production Caddy file, but I can do that in a minute. I'm going to look in here on my to-do list. Okay. Yeah, I'll go ahead and add my production Caddy file as well. So I'll copy this one, rename. Production. And so this one is going to be similar to before, but instead I'm going to deploy it to, let's say, MERN.mySuperAwesomeSite.com. And we'll do that on port 443. I need to specify the email address. So I actually own mySuperAwesomeSite.com, so that's why I can do this. TLS with my email address that I use to purchase that. So when it goes off and tries to provision that certificate, it needs to confirm my identity in order to be able to do that. So we'll do that. The other portions of this, we still want that route set to /srv. Our route now looks okay. Yeah, so I think everything there should be fine. We just had to add that one line. And now we need to update this accordingly. So I'll do that. So now we're going to tag it production. And now we want these build args, so they're going to be slightly different. So now instead of the local Caddy file here, we'll do production. We're tagging it correctly. Our API now, our base URL is actually going to be https://mern.mysupersite.com/API. Okay. That's good, that's good. And so now in our top level makefile, we'll have build local, build production, build. We do need to modify our compose file to be able to use those. But I'm actually going to take a quick break to grab some water, and I will be back in just a couple of minutes. So be back in a few. All right, I am back. I see a little bit of noise coming on my mic, so let me check something. Okay, let's jump back into it. I had just modified my Docker files and my make targets to be able to run these new versions. Let's get my Caddy file-based deployment running locally. And so in order to do that, I'm going to do a couple of things. Yeah, so my Docker compose file now, I don't have my MongoDB database because that's running in Atlas. That should be fine. I do need to pass in my environment files to my API server. And so that's going to contain the connection string to the Atlas DB instance. And so here, I'll do env file, and that will be /server/config/ and we will pass the environment variable as an environment, the local versus production as an environment variable env.env when we actually run this. So like here, when we're doing run production, we'll say env equals local and env equals production. And so that will allow the single Docker Compose file to select between my different environment files. So that should be good. I also no longer need this because I'm not using that development React server anymore. So let's go ahead and see if that will run. Oh, I do need to pass it the particular file that I'm using though. So now that I've renamed my Docker Compose file, I need to specify the -f. This will be Docker Compose -production.yaml. Similarly here and similarly here, but this one will be dev. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and run my make build local target. And so that's going off and building the local version of my React client. So that's gonna build the static files, put them in the Caddy file using the caddyfile.local variant. So here we see it creating the production build. We grab that new Docker file, the image from Docker Hub, the Caddy file one. We built our API server. Okay, that's good. Now let's do make run local. I fully expect to get errors here, but we shall see. React app. Okay. Let's do localhost 80. So the client appears to be working correctly. If I do create movie, 1, 2, 3, add movie, I do not get a success. So let's look at our developer tools here and see 404. Okay. So what did we get when we spun up the server? Server running, trace deprecation. Docker Compose production, environment local. Okay, Docker PS. So I think I forgot to change the image tag within my production. Yeah. So here I'm still using my same tag here and here. I think that I need to then also include this environment variable so that when I run my Docker run command, it knows to use the version that I tagged as local, and here I'm tagging that as local and production. Base URL, localhost 5000. Okay. So make build local. Evan Dewey, wow, this is some complex stuff. You're a very smart guy. Thanks, Evan. Really appreciate it. So we've got the new version successfully built, API server latest. I also need to run that when I do here. Okay. Okay, the front end seemed fine before, but it was the back end didn't seem like it was connecting properly to the database. Okay. Oh, okay. So localhost 80. So it's loading properly, but when I click on the path, it actually removes my port specification on local. And so I wonder if that has to do with my Caddy file. Like it's stripping off that port 80 there. Okay. Run local. So I'm here. So why does that go directly to there? Let's see if I hit the API directly. API/movies. So the API appears to be working correctly. I'm getting back the JSON object from the database, but there's something incorrect about my Caddy file that is causing it to mess up. So that's how it was. Dockerfile, expose 80, expose 443. I do want to mount in a volume for my Caddy data and Caddy config, but I don't think that is the issue. All right, because I go here, get my application, create movie. Test 1, 2, 3, 1, 1. The insert works successfully. But if I go to just list, I get this error. If I go to API/movies, test 1, 2, 3. Okay, so it looks like I'm not actually inserting it successfully because nothing, yeah, the version that I just entered is not showing up, the test 1, 3, 1, 2, 3. So it still seems to be an issue with my database connection, but I would have expected it to give me an error when I started my server if that was the case. So let's just change this to be something nonsensical. And then we'll rebuild. So we would expect this to then fail when it tries to set up our connection, because this is not an actual database. It does fail. Okay. How are we using on the front end? React app base URL. Oh, I think, let's see. So there it was localhost 5000. Here it was my base URL. And that I'm specifying as this. Action. This is not very exciting, but just some real life debugging going on here. Let's see. Localhost 80. Route. So let me just try to go to the API server itself. Hello world. Movies. /list. No, cannot get. I should be able to go to that path. /movies. Cannot get movies. That's weird. Hello, Hernan Mendez. You joined at a very boring time where I'm just trying to debug why I just separated out sort of a development and local and production configuration. And now I'm trying to run my local configuration and the front end is working. So if I go to localhost 80, we get my application. I can see this page, but when I go to list, I get cannot read property length of undefined. And it's returning nothing. I wonder if I have an issue with my Atlas config where I'm not actually able to read. Let's see, database access. Network access includes my current IP. Okay, it's fine. Why can I not get movies? Not found. Well, I'm going to continue on and get my virtual machine set up, and hopefully as I do that process, something will come to me in terms of why this is not working as expected. I do want to make one additional change, and that is in my Docker Compose production, I'm going to mount in a volume for my client, and that is going to be where I store my TLS certificate. So it's going to spin up and get a HTTPS certificate for me to serve on. And so that will be at the location Caddy data. And that's wherever on the host system it's going to store it. And then data here inside the container. And Caddy config. And that will be the config directory. Okay. I think that is fine. So we did this, we did this, we did this. Right, that's good. And then, what else? We did this, but it's not really working. So we're gonna give ourselves an X for now. And then I'm gonna move on to part 3, and hopefully we can figure out what's going on along the way. So in order to do that, I'm going to go to DigitalOcean. I'm going to start by creating a virtual machine. And again, the better way to do this, the DevOps way, would be to use something like Terraform or another infrastructure as code tool to provision these. I'm just going to do it in the GUI for the sake of time. Docker on Ubuntu is the marketplace image. This is a really nice starting point if you're using Docker and just want to get something up and running very quickly. It will have Docker and Docker Compose pre-installed on the machine. I don't need much compute power at all. Let's just go ahead. I'm going to tear this down afterwards, though, so I might as well pick something that has a little bit of juice behind it. That should be fine. Create droplet. I am then going to go to networking and firewalls, and I have this HTTP firewall rule, so it's going to allow traffic on port 80, allow traffic on port 443, and allow me to SSH into it, and I just need to connect that droplet to it. It will show up here. Not sure why it's not showing up. Let's see. Oh, it's not provisioned yet. Docker Ubuntu. Okay, so it is now provisioned, and we should be able to add it to this firewall. Oh. Firewalls, HTTP traffic, droplets, add. There it is. And then I also need to add a rule to my Atlas database configuration that will allow me to connect to this machine. So I'm going to copy that IP address, go to here and add, edit this to match my current virtual machine. Confirm. While that is applying, let's set up a make target in order to SSH into this machine. String, it's going to be root at the IP address, SSH. So by using root at that IP address, I can then hopefully connect to that machine. So let's kill that. Add it to my known hosts. And now this is a session on that machine. So that's great. I also need to add a domain name record, a DNS record pointing to this machine. So I'll go here to Cloudflare, and we're going to do something like MERN.mysuperawesomesite.com. Point it there, save. Because I'm using Caddy, it's going to use unencrypted connections to set up the HTTPS certificate. So I need to set this to flexible, and later I'll upgrade it to full once we've provisioned that. I don't want to save. Okay. Now, I want to actually copy my code to this machine. And so the proper way to do this would be to actually have a system like GitHub Actions or Circle CI or GitLab have a pipeline that builds these images and pushes them to a container registry like Docker Hub or Google Container Registry. Many of the cloud providers have a container registry. The way that I'm going to get this code onto the system is to copy all the files from my local system onto the machine using an SCP secure copy. And then I'm going to build the images and run them there directly. So I'm going to do copy files, and we're going to use the SCP command recursively for this whole directory. And then we're going to pass it that SSH string. And then the path on the system that we're going to copy to is just going to be root, because that is the home directory for the root user, which we are using to log in. So let's do make copy files. There we go. Everything's getting copied over. One thing that we don't necessarily need to do is copy all of those node modules. So I'm actually just going to delete them since I don't need them, since I'm using Docker anyways. So get rid of that. Get rid of that. And that should vastly cut down on the number of files that we actually need to copy. And there we're good. Make SSH. And if I do an ls, I can see all of my local files were copied into this directory. Make is not installed out of the box, so if I do make, it will not be found, but I can then install it with apt install make. And so now I should be able to do make build production. And fingers crossed, it's going to build our production images with all of the necessary configurations. I'm probably going to run into the same bug that I ran into locally, unless it has to do with the Caddy file config and the production one is correct, but the local one was incorrect for whatever reason. But we will find out here shortly. Hello from Romania, Savulescu Adrian. Hello. And hello, Hamza Zuhid al-Islam. Welcome to the stream. We are just trying to copy our code onto the DigitalOcean VM that I just set up, and we're building the images there, and then we're going to try to run it. We have a React client that we are using on the front end. When we're developing locally, we run that as a development server. When we run it in production, we're actually building it into a static set of HTML, JavaScript, and CSS files, and then serving that with a Caddy web server. We have an Express-based API, and then our database, when we were running locally for development, we were running it inside of a container. All of this set up with Docker Compose. When we're running it in production, we're going to have it in MongoDB Atlas, which is a database as a service product from Mongo. And it is building our images. Oh, I did not set my base URL in my makefile, did I? That, I think, is my issue from before. Oh no, I did within this makefile. Okay, I did set it. But it looks like our Docker images have built, so I can do Docker image list, and we can see we have API server, we have React app production latest. And so I'm going to do make run production and see what happens. Oh. Caddy file, read write. But it was not found here. So I defined this, but I didn't define a volume in the volume section. So let's do Caddy data driver local Caddy config driver local. The question, hi, would like to know why do you use a makefile? Isn't Docker Compose sufficient? Docker Compose file would be sufficient. I just don't want to have to memorize and get correct all these different options. Like I'm setting this environment variable local for these two. I'm passing it the name of the Docker Compose file. And so I could type this out every time, but this is just a way for me to separate the different commands and keep them organized so that later when I come back, I'll be able to find them and use them appropriately. Chris Fisher says, thanks, found you from Traversy Media. Great video, great content. Thank you, Chris. We just added that data volume to our Docker Compose production file. We are going to exit from here we'll do make copy files to get the updated file into our system. Make SSH, make build production. Okay, and then make run production. We see it setting up the HTTPS. It looks like it was successful. Releasing lock, that's a good sign. So I'm actually going to go to MERN.mySuperAwesomeSite.com. Oh, first I'm going to upgrade this to full. So now that we have our certificate, we want the traffic from Cloudflare to our origin server, that's our Caddy server, to be encrypted. So that's why I set it to full. And our configuration is actually enforcing that traffic must come on 443 over the encrypted line. And so that's why it didn't work a minute ago. But if I refresh, still not working. Ah, there we go. We have our application, list movies, and we get movies from our MongoDB database, live demo movie. That is 10 out of 10, and the time is 4:34. Add movie, success, list movies, and there we have it. So if everyone in the chat wants to go to that site, you should now be able to load it and interact with it. Yeah, so I'm not sure what was going on local. It was something to do with how I was capturing the URI path or URL. And so when I tried to hit the /list/movies path, it was somehow getting truncated and not properly passed to the API. So I'll probably debug that offline, but it appears that everything is working in our production version. I would want to do a couple of things. Like, for example, I would probably run this in the background. So I would add a -d flag here. Actually, how does Docker Compose handle running things as a daemon? Yeah, so you can add the -d option to run it in the background. What else? I would want to there. Cool, green check marks across the board, except for our local version of the production config was not quite working right. But I'll probably figure that out offline, like I was saying. But anyways, what else would I want to do before deploying this? MERN, mySuperAwesomeSite.com. I mean, one thing that comes to mind is that currently this API doesn't require any authentication to connect to. So you can just go in and anyone can create movies and delete movies. And so depending on the purpose of the application, that may or may not make sense. If you could add user authentication, you could either implement it yourself and have passwords, and you could store those passwords, or you could store a hash of those passwords in the database. You could use an external provider like a Google OAuth or maybe an Auth0 setup as a way to add individual user accounts, and then you could set up permissioning on the API itself such that only certain users could modify the values, or you could have a separate listing for each user, for example. So that would be another good step to take as you were working to productionize this thing. You probably also wouldn't pass the environment variables as a file, because now make SSH, where am I? cd ... Now in my code on this VM, I have config, cd config. I have these files that contain my secrets, my connection string to that database. So I'm going to actually remove those, star.env. So those are no longer there. the proper way to do that would be when you issue your Docker compose command, or if you're doing individual Docker commands, you would pass them each as environment variables on the command line. So we could have something like this, where instead of passing an end file, we could use, let's see what it is actually, Docker compose environment variables. Yeah, so you would have something like environment, and then we could say mongo URI, and that could be equals, and then we could actually pass that from our makefile. We could have that, and then in our makefile, when we actually spin that up, we could have mongo URI passed in like so. So that would be another improvement over the way we did it with the environment variables, or sorry, the environment variable file. We also then wouldn't need to use .env, the node package. We could do it directly. I think that is about it. Any other questions from the chat before I go ahead and sign off? Thanks for tuning in, and hopefully this was helpful as we migrated the system from sort of a baseline locally running node system, Dockerized it, got it set up with Docker Compose locally, made the necessary modifications to have a production build of that React client, changed some environment variable setup to combine the two so that it was a little easier to work with between development and production, so that we can actually use as similar of setup as possible and just make the modifications in our configuration versus in our application. And then set up and ran it on a virtual machine in DigitalOcean. All right, I'm going to sign off. Thanks, everyone. Take care.